Why can't we have the best of both worlds? The joyous freedom and sense of infinite possibility of the toy box world of the Hyrule of the Wild, with the sense of narrative progression and escalating accomplishment and mastery of the classic Zelda formula. I'm not criticising either, I genuinely love both styles, but surely the dream of many a Zelda fan is to capture the magic of both at once. A seamless open-air game with room for exploration and user-initiated solutions combined with a strong story and dungeons designed with a sense of progression in mind. It sounds impossible. Surely the two are diametrically opposed. And even if they weren't, not every brilliant thing needs to be mixed or cheese ice cream would be a thing. But Nintendo has always had an eye for an impossible vision. I'm reminded of Shigeru Miyamoto tasking the neophyte Tokyo development studio with creating a spherical Mario platformer, which led them to creating Super Mario Galaxy. And we know that Nintendo does listen to feedback and will be aware that as celebrated and as glorious as the Hero of the Wild games are, there is still an unscratched itch from the classic formula. Furthermore, we know that Zelda director Hidemaru Fujibashi's history shows that he is no one-trick pony. If you want to learn more about Fujibashi-san, check out the playlist up here where I deep dive his history with the Zelda franchise and his philosophy of games, and also analyse how he's changed the Zelda formula. Nevertheless, just with Skyward Sword and Tears of the Kingdom, he has given us both the most linear and the most open Zelda ever, and his nigh on 30 years of experience of making Zelda games surely puts him in the perfect position to rise to yet another enormous challenge of uniting the two styles of Zelda. First then, let's look at what the strong elements are of each playstyle that we need to preserve and develop. The open world formula is brilliant for freedom, for exploration, for user-initiated discovery. We all have a different story of leaving the Great Plateau for the first time, of the time when we found a great weapon and saved it for just the right moment, of when and where we were when we realised what had happened to Zelda in Tears of the Kingdom. Giving the player a personalised story that is self-generated through their actions and interactions with the world can be really powerful. Similarly, we can all remember looking at that vast, impenetrably dark map of the depths and gradually uncovering it and feeling that sense of accomplishment, or finally getting to that Sky Island and realising that there's a Gleeok there and getting destroyed. Whereas my playthrough of Link's Awakening on the original Game Boy as a child always ground to a halt around Canalet Castle as I couldn't figure out the one thing I needed to do to progress. In the new Zelda formula there are always dozens of things you can do to progress at any one time and multiple different solutions, so there's no penalty if your mind doesn't happen to work the same way as the particular developer of the puzzle. If one shrine is a stumper, there are scores more out there to find. This is one of the most valuable things about the new games that must be preserved, and I mean valuable as in it literally generates value for Nintendo because it keeps people playing their Jewel in the Crown title and talking about it as opposed to wandering off after a few hours. The threshold to being able to progress is always low, and it's always comprehensible what you need to do. In fact, ultimately the only threshold to progression is to find one boss and become powerful enough to defeat that boss. This de-stresses the whole game so much because there's no sense that the player is penalised for not understanding a way forward. I really think half the reason people rack up such vast playtimes in the Switch Zelda games is not just that there's a lot to do, although there is, and not just that the games are brilliantly made, although they are, but specifically because they have gone through and systematically ironed out as many points of friction as possible. The points that in other games would have you walking away barely exist in the wilds of Hyrule. Moreover, the organic sense of discovery is generated by the clever interaction of so many different moving parts. If melee combat stresses you out, you can play at least the overworld portions of the game as a stealth experience. If you're too impatient for that, just go in and smash everything to bits and it should all work out in the end. Or maybe you just prefer to build something to take down the enemies for you by tinkering around with the Zonai devices. You really can, as the slogan goes, play your way. However, the one thing that this gameplay style struggles to deliver is a true and authentic sense of progression. That's not to say there's no progression. Acquiring new weapons, completing the dungeons and shrines, filling out the map, uncovering the truth about Zelda's whereabouts, these all carry with them a sense of accomplishment. But because the open world formula is so gloriously free and unencumbered, the flip side of that experience is that challenges are concurrent rather than sequential. Take the temples. The challenge given at the start is to find 5 keys, which can be done in any order. Yes, you need to find them all, which means there are many concurrent challenges, but these all belong to the same, tier, or let's say, to avoid confusion, phase of the dungeon. You enter the dungeon, and you have the phase where you're looking for keys, and then you have the phase where you fight the final boss. And essentially the open world is exactly the same. Because nothing is compulsory, if you boil the structure down to its essentials, you just need to clear the tutorial area, find the final boss, and defeat him. The same goes for narrative. I was hugely excited by the story of Tears of the Kingdom and dropped almost everything in the game to track down the Tears early on. But I pretty much got the gist of what had happened at a relatively early point because there was no sequencing. To be clear, it's not that the reveal was non-linear, Some of my favourite storytelling is non-linear, but even non-linear storytelling has a progression of reveals that is carefully modulated to provide continual, exciting revelations. Compare, for example, Link's Awakening, a game that is a fraction of the size of Breath of the Wild, and yet makes such an incredible use of pacing to build up drama. Hints as to the nature of the island and who the Windfish is are gradually teased out, and although you can puzzle the egg from the outside, it takes a long time to get there. There is also an evolution of your relationship with Marin, not a huge amount, but the iconic midpoint scene with her is perfectly timed so that you know the character and like her, and it's meaningful to really get to know her hopes and dreams, given the player emotional stakes as concurrently you realise that waking the Windfish is going to have terrible consequences for everybody on this beautiful and magical island that you've slowly been getting to know. Furthermore, each dungeon has a specific sequence, and the skills and powers you gain in each allow the world to be unfolded just a little bit more, as after every dungeon you're reappraising the tiny game map and seeing the world as new. On paper, Link's Awakening's map is so incredibly tiny that it should barely hold anyone's attention, but because you're really getting to grow with the map, you feel enthusiastic at every step. Somehow, despite its tiny size, Koholint Island feels huge, and that's because it is so dense and so alive and so developed. What we're seeing here is that there are two particular sections where progression is missed, and they're both ones that benefit from a more controlled user experience. The first is story. For any story, from a joke to an epic saga, timing is everything, and the open world narrative intrinsically surrenders timing to little more than chance as the player stumbles around the world. The second is in dungeons, where you lose the sense of having a giant interconnected puzzle that escalates in size as you progress, because each puzzle is disconnected from the whole. So, what can be done? One technique Nintendo developers often use to make their games and look at them through new perspectives is identifying a key underlying theme. However, themes can take many different forms. Sometimes they relate to a play experience. For Super Mario 3D World, the theme was empathy. They wanted players collaborating, looking out for each other, and responding to each other. Other times the themes can be more practical. For Tears of the Kingdom, it was hands, and you see this from the hand symbol on the shrines to the way Ultra Hand is a central concept of the game. An additional focus for Tears of the Kingdom was the concept of seamlessness, the idea of being able to travel seamlessly from the sky to the depths and back again, and to move across the world and from place to place without loading. A final example of a theme is Super Mario Odyssey, where Kenta Motokora's team focused on surprise. And so every aspect of Odyssey is filled with astonishing moments where everything gets turned on its head. Okay then, here's the challenge. What would happen if you took the values of the open-air games, low threshold accessibility, multiplicative gameplay from interaction with the environments and items, a hugely accessible open world, user-generated story, and put it through the theme of progression, particularly with respects to story and key dungeons? Let's explore what it would look like by diagramming it. Now look, I'm not the Boss Keys channel and this is not going to be anywhere close to what they do, but I must admit, I like the idea of trying to boil down something very complex into a diagram, so let's give it a go, and I apologise if these are quite rudimentary. Here is linear Zelda simplified. One event leads to the next, leads to the next, leads to the next. It's literally linear because if you chart it, it's a line. Here's open air Zelda simplified. There's a linear beginning and end point because even the Nintendo hotshots haven't figured out how to change that, but fundamentally the middle is now completely open. Any coordinate on the middle of this map represents a different challenge point, and you can take any of these challenges before progressing to the final one. Essentially, if linear Zelda had a one-dimensional structure, open air Zelda has a two-dimensional structure. We'll come back to these two models in a second, but let's just look and see what we could do within the two-dimensional structure we have at the moment to sharpen the transition points and build in a greater sense of progression. First of all, the game world will benefit from a home base. The Great Plateau for me has such a nostalgic pull, and seeing it go all Deathly Hallows in Tears of the Kingdom was truly distressing. But there was never much sense of it being a true home base that you could return to. The Champions Ballad DLC had you return there for extra quests, but it wasn't a progression of the story of the area, so much as an isolated event that just happened to be placed in a location that had an emotional resonance with the player. Tears of the Kingdom had a little bit more of this with Lookout Landing, but the best analogy for what I'd be looking to see is Tarrytown. Tarrytown truly develops throughout Breath of the Wild if you initiate the quest, and because you need to find people from all across the map, it's difficult to build Tarrytown to its fullest extent all at once. Giving adventures in the overworld a consequence in Link's home base would be a powerful change, but it's got to be more than just a character or two showing up in Lookout Landing. I would like to see how these actually affect gameplay and narrative, and how these different characters interact with each other once they've reached the home base. However, another structural change would be to rearrange the map to emphasize the concept of a journey. Now, Zelda games are often advertised using the term journey, but the reality is that very few of the linear games really meet that criteria. Yes, Link goes out adventuring, but he's forever popping back to Castletown or Skyloft or wherever it might be. So if the open world games are going to move away from a home base, then truly embracing the idea of a journey with a map that suits might be a good step. One simple adjustment would be to change the shape of the map and elongate it so the player is funneled to a slightly greater degree. With fast travel, it would still be possible to bop in and around the map late game, but in the early stages it would allow for the map to be sequenced in a way that gives a little bit more progression in terms of challenge, in terms of story, in terms of theme, in fact in any respect. Now, these maps would still be open. If you think of the regions of the map of the wild, they cover a large span, and it would be for players to decide how they want to traverse each one, whether they want to blast through or explore in depth. But it would just nudge people slightly because they would be experiencing each of these in a particular order. They wouldn't even need to use an odd linear map shape. Check out the map of the original Shining Force, which obliges you to travel in a circle around the central ocean. Especially if the next Zelda makes ocean traversal possible in the late game, this would be an elegant way to create natural obstacles. Stage 1 of the game would involve travel on land, circling the continent and exploring it. Stage 2 would make available ocean travel, allowing you to bop back and forth across the map and revisit locations from a new perspective. Inevitably, there would be speedrunning shortcuts that would allow players to skip whole chunks of this, but for the majority of players, their experience would finally be of an extended journey. And because the developers could be reasonably sure of what players' skill levels and familiarity with the story would be when they reach each location, it would be easier to sequence events. And let's not pretend they don't do this already. There is already an understated sequence in Breath of the Wild. Your game is significantly easier if you listen to the king and go to Kakariko Village, and there is enough variety in the challenge of the levels of the Divine Beast and the Tears Temples that it's possible to say that there is an ideal progression between each dungeon, even in the games as they stand. Putting the open world into a sequence simply would make this more manifest for players who are happy to follow the narrative rhythms, while not in any way gatekeeping those people who would rather ignore the map and explore completely free. Another way to change the shape of the map would be even more radical, and yet more true to how Zelda has always been, and that is to take the game another dimension beyond. We talked about the 1D and the 2D models of Zelda, but if linear Zelda could be mapped in one dimension and open air Zelda in two, what if we had three? By this I mean that you would start with an open world, but as the game progresses there would be an event or events which permanently alter the world in a drastic and irrevocable manner. Perhaps late game or even post game there would be a way of returning to the original state purely to allow people the joy of exploring every facet of the game world, but to all intents and purposes the world would have meaningfully progressed from its starting point. This has its challenges. Tears of the Kingdom took 6 years to develop, even with the original structure of its Hyrule in place, and while I don't for a second imagine that defining the world took the majority of this time compared to redefining the mechanics and other complexities caused by global circumstances, it would nevertheless be a challenge for the Zelda team to reconfigure their world drastically mid-game. But I think it is possible using Hidemaru Fujibashi's existing approach of seeking out multiplicative gameplay experiences. By this, he means that he wants to build mechanics which could interact with every other mechanic to create vastly larger numbers of playstyles and possibilities. He explained that he didn't dedicate time to letting Link pet the dogs in Hyrule because while it would be endearing, the time spent on the mechanic wouldn't have had any greater application in any other parts of the game, whereas, say, the Ascend mechanic was something that could be utilised across the game map. What he needs, therefore, is a multiplicative mechanic that applies either to the central character of Link, or to the world of Hyrule, or to both. A small set of changes that will change every aspect of the game as a consequence. An obvious possibility, but one I don't think they should explore if they want to truly balance open and linear experiences, is using a low rule or twilight variant of the world, or even using a small world of the Picori as was once prototyped for Breath of the Wild. Although on the surface these are different worlds and offer something new, they don't quite operate in a multiplicative way in relation to the original world. Yes, it's a chance to recycle the map and do different things with it, and Tears of the Kingdom actually did a little of this when they took the surface map of Hyrule and inverted it to give them the base map for the depths. But essentially this is locked into a linear sequence. With the Picori, these tiny areas will be essentially new places on the map that just happen to be hidden in small areas, and having a low-rule version of Hyrule would just be a new location and presumably one that, sooner or later, Link could bop back and forth between. It's a clever way to extend the map, but I would argue that if you map the gameplay, it would still be 2D. But Fujibayashi's early Zelda games give us an excellent route map to some ways to create a more three-dimensional experience. In fact, his first titles, Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages, give us two stunning possibilities, namely, and they are in the name, Seasons and Ages. Let's start with Seasons. The Zelda engine already has a well-developed weather mechanic which changes as the world progresses, and there have already been examples within the game of where you see different places in different stages. Rito Village in Tears of the Kingdom before and after Link and Turin Save the Day being a prime example. But these are in the main superficial changes. I absolutely love the eerie music of the blighted Rito Village and the way the narrative puts real stakes in place for the villagers. It's the sort of thing that really benefits from being a sequel, as we had such familiarity and understanding of the original Rito Village, and seeing it corrupted was, if you'll pardon the pun, chilling. But seeing how the world changes through the seasons could have a really big impact. What if this kind of thing wasn't just an isolated event, but something that applied across the game world? Seeing how the world changes through the changing of the seasons could have a really big impact with how we interact with the world and how we progress through it. Technically though, what would it require? Is it even achievable? A lot of the requirements are already encoded and could in theory be adapted. Weather would need to be amended, so some weather types are more or less frequent during particular seasons. The angle of the sun would need to be changed, and obstacles linked to snow could be more densely placed in winter. Existing mechanics around Link's sensitivity to heat and cold would still be used. Requiring a little more thought would be water levels at different stages and the relative frequencies of locations of different animals and monsters. The flora of the world would require a good deal more development from the art team, particularly the trees, and by including a more developed wind mechanic, they could softly gate traversal even with the paraglider in place. So some locations could be all but impassable except for incredibly skilled speedrunner types until the prevailing winds change and you'll be able to paraglide through. But so far, everything I've described is still what I would consider using a 2D structure. The key to making it 3D is that the world and the characters not just change, but progress. Dramatic events like tornadoes and floods, whole map snow coverage and different narrative events at different times in the story would certainly help with this. New parts of areas that we thought we previously discovered. It could be, in order to be fair to the open world aesthetic of the game, that these aspects were always available if you really looked. But now it will be possible to access them in a much different manner. Another great potential of this would be having deliberate actions by characters in the game affect the landscape. The excavation of an archaeological site that progresses from season to season, or the building of a bridge, let alone more dramatic changes such as an earthquake or forest fires or building a dam. And of course the game would be so much better if the actions of one season have a consequence for the subsequent season. The key here is that it should never feel like the player is being penalised for not making a change. This could be either achieved through some late game season control mechanic, or better still, by having actions in an earlier season create different consequences later on. Not necessarily worse, just different, which would also increase the replayability of the titles. For example, if a cave is passable in summer but obscured in winter, it should be possible to get to the cave, simply more challenging, even if you're at a time of the year where it appears to be blocked off. The potential here is particularly great for dungeons and shrines. I love shrines, and although I have some reservations, I did enjoy all the Breath and Tears dungeons, but they are essentially one and done puzzle box experiences. What if you had dungeons though that you need to revisit in each season, and the extent to which you'd planned ahead would dictate the level of challenge you experienced and the items you could acquire in the subsequent seasons? I would think to familiarise players with the multi-season mechanics they would need to have shrines which simulated multiple seasons at once, so players got the sense of playing with the configurations. But after that, we could see dungeons which need to be traversed in multiple stages at different points during the game. This allows them to still have smaller, more self-contained puzzle elements, while also satisfying long-time players' urge to have something more complicated. It could be that at each season there's only a small amount to do with the dungeon, but because you're going back to them after each season, and the dungeons are changing, and the layout is changing, and you have to reconceptualize what you understood about the dungeon, you're going to have a different play experience. Even with this though, we're still talking about adding or subtracting individual routes or tinkering with specific dungeon configurations. These are not yet fully multiplicative mechanics. For a multiplicative experience, I would suggest the team should develop a biology engine. They already created a chemistry engine for Breath of the Wild, allowing for fire and ice to affect other objects throughout the game world. They greatly developed the physics engine for use with Ultra Hand in Tears of the Kingdom, but a biology engine would really multiply out the potential ways to play, ticking a box for open air, while also being intrinsically sequential because biology involves plants and animals growing and changing over time. ticking the boxes for a linear experience as well. Let's start with plants. For one thing, being able to grow flowers and even trees, let alone vegetables and fruit, would have a tangible effect on the world and could be used for multiple large-scale puzzles. Being able to pollinate different plants and harvest them would be useful. Moreover, you might need to think about the location of the trees you plant, or perhaps you could plant beanstalks which allow you to grow your way to access impassable areas in the skies. Obviously these would be some fast-growing trees, but since some of the trees in Zelda talk, it wouldn't be the first time that a Hyrule adventure has been arboreally avant-garde. Vines could be used to access buildings, and there might be particular fruits that can be harvested in the later seasons. In the summer, a challenge might be to prevent crops being damaged and to consider access to water and perhaps different soils. What if there were quests to access wells that were only applicable during the summer months? You wouldn't want Zelda to end up as yet another farming sim on a Nintendo system, but it's a small extension of the cooking mechanic to let Link grow food. However, the real advantages of a biology engine would come with the animals. Enemy AI in the wild games is already really advanced in many places, and I have spent much happy time watching bokoblins from afar and enjoying their range of expressions and activities before finding my perfect moment to strike. It's also great that Tears of the Kingdom massively expanded the number of enemies, because these enemies could be reused and developed in a subsequent game, rather than starting from scratch and going back to the rather threadbare enemy count of Breath of the Wild. But having creatures grow and change with the seasons, having them stronger or weaker depending on the availability of plants in the local area, including plants you may have had a hand in propagating, would give the whole landscape a real sense of continued progression and age. Would sparing a nest of bokoblin babies in the spring lead to different events in winter than if you just went in there and took them all out? Are there creatures that might only grow under certain conditions? Are there some animals that are endangered and which would require very specific management to save, including thinking about their food chains? And it could apply to people as well. Perhaps, depending on which NPCs you introduce to each other in the spring, there could be different family setups in the winter. Different houses being built, different shops available. Or if you start planning ahead for medicine in the summer, then illnesses in the winter could be more readily cured. The potential for puzzle solving is huge, but these would not be small-scale, bite-sized puzzles, but problems that require real systemic thinking about the world and how it interacts, much in the same way that the traditional dungeons sometimes required you to step back and see the big picture of how everything is configured. But if the biology engine is interesting applied to the world, just imagine how interesting it could be applied to Link himself. Look, the idea of Link being different at different ages is hardly new, but we usually just have a child and adult version. What if Link actually aged as the game progressed? Probably not organically, but perhaps growing up in big starts as a result of completing each dungeon. The youngest version of Link might be significantly underpowered compared to his adult self and struggle with basic techniques like climbing, but the final version, a kind of old man Link, would now face more difficult challenges. Of course, it's possible that you could just have a time jump in the game, and so this would also allow the world to be different as all the NPCs would grow up alongside, giving a Zelda game with a truly epic scope as it could take place over decades and decades. And while the traditional progression of the game is that the character grows ever stronger, perhaps in this case the final battle could be with Link at a distinct disadvantage physically, but therefore relying even more on buffs and the resources he's acquired through exploitation of the biology, chemistry and physics engines throughout the prior seasons. There is a risk that this feels like a return to the kind of gated experience of the older games without sufficiently embracing the unbridled freedom of the new formula, but I think each open world would feel sufficiently vast and generate enough play opportunities that the player would only want to move on when they were ready to shake things up, at which point the skills and techniques the player had developed until that point could be applied afresh to the new version of the world. If it's too restricted to have the change from season to season, or from age to age be permanent and irreversible, there could be areas utilising Skyward Sword style timeshift stones, allowing for more exploration of other times even after you've left or before you've gone to a particular season. I can even imagine, though I very much doubt it would ever happen, a mode where your movements and actions in the past are recorded and then you can go back in time to see your past self moving around, with the exact same choices and game mechanics being played out in front of you. You can literally watch yourself playing the game. At this point you would have to navigate your way around the map without crossing paths with yourself, because we all know what happens in time travel stories. Now look, given the number of times the games allow you to pause and access menus or slow down time for action, I don't think it would work enormously well, because you couldn't really see yourself in real time without the player appearing to pause every 5 seconds. But if it could be made to work, if time travel could be built in not just as a story point in the game but as a mechanic that you really interact with, and have the experience of nearly meeting yourself in the past, it would certainly lead to a very memorable experience and something that is completely unique to each player. I haven't really talked too much about the story so far, and that's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the stories in these games are always designed late on to best reflect the mechanics of the game. They don't come up with the story first, they come up with the story last, only after everything else has been nailed down. But secondly, in a sense, the story is irrelevant because they can tell almost any story by hooking the key events onto the, let's say, 4-season structure. Certain events would only happen in summer and others only in winter, meaning that you could have something like Link's Awakening, where the true nature of the world is only gradually revealed to the player, by linking each revelation to a particular season. And beyond the specific scripted story elements, there is the potential for a natural sense of story evolution to occur through the confluence of all these different mechanics. As the winter sets in and the world becomes tougher and grittier, there's that extra incentive for the player to move towards the endgame, and bring back the joy of spring to an embattled Hyrule. The blunt fact is that even the more story-rich Zeldas only ever turned on a few key events, and so having 3 or 4 major stages to the evolution of the open-air world would be more than sufficient to hook on key events that generate a strong sense of progression. Of course, all these ideas might just be flights of idle fancy. Generally, this channel tries to analyse likelihoods, but it's impossible to know what's in the head of these genius creators and whether they're even remotely interested in trying to put progression back at the heart of the next Zelda title. Knowing their commitment to listen and respond to feedback, I don't think a more progression-centric open-air game is impossible, but I'm not going to pretend to have any kind of clue as to what the precise likelihoods are. Perhaps, like Paper Mario, the change of formula will simply be something that the company ignores going forward. Or perhaps they will decide that it's too difficult to resolve the open air and the linear formats and put them back together again. While I would like a flavour of the original games back, I can't deny that I fell absolutely head over heel with both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and it's difficult to do much but have faith in the judgment of Fujibashi-san and his team, even if it's never going to be 100% perfect. Nevertheless, the ideas in this video represent the best chance I can think of to bridge the gap between the free and open new game model and the best part of a tightly designed Swiss watch story and gameplay experience. But if you have different thoughts, please leave them below after you like and subscribe, and please check out my deep dives into Hidemaru Fujibashi and other Zelda content in the playlist here. Thank you so much for watching, and see you soon.